This video is going to cover using the Doorkeeper gem to create a proper API authentication system. This is going to give you the ability to have multiple clients that you can authenticate with. So think different applications. You'll actually be administering client IDs and client secrets. You'll have users with their own authentication that they can then use to log into your system through either Rails website, like you can see here. So I can log in with dean@example.com and a password of password. This will allow you to browse the website as an admin over here. If you're not logged in as an admin, you can then just do a regular John Doe account, which I'll log into right now, john@doe.com and a password of password. And if you're not a admin, it'll just redirect you back to the home page. You'll also have restricted API access points. This one can only be accessed via the API, which I can open right here. And if I come over to my headers, I'm passing in my authorization bearer token. And if I send that, we should see I get a response back with the one book that we just saw on the other page right here. If I log back into the admin account, dean@example.com and a password of password. So this is the same book that we just saw there. And then we also have an endpoint for a Android books section, which is just accessible even if you're not an admin. It'll just have those details. And the reason why this is so good is because there's not a lot of hacking together to make this work like in a traditional API setup with Rails. Here instead, Doorkeeper is going to do a lot of the heavy lifting. We are going to be looking at some more advanced examples of some Rails functionality. So there is something to learn even if you are familiar with the Doorkeeper gem. And thanks to a member of the community, Nejdet Kadirsh set up a lovely Doorkeeper demo application. I'll have a link to this in the video description. So this was based on, I think 2 months ago with Ruby 2.7, but this comes complete with a, oops, not that one. It comes complete with a Swagger API documentation. So when you clone that repo and set it up, you have access to this API documentation that has explanations for how to do your user login, user logout, and how to register a user all through the API. So your actual application also comes with that. We're not going to be covering Swagger, but that is something to take a look at if you're interested. Of course, it's fully tested and it's set up properly. So this is kind of what we're going to be mimicking. And we're also going to be referencing this Ruby Yagi post, which I'll also have a link to in the video description on how to use the Doorkeeper gem. So I'm sort of combining a lot of these texts here, and then in future tutorials, we can use these for actual proper React authentication systems and Vue authentication systems. But okay, that's going to do it for this long-winded intro. Let's actually get started on this application. So I'm going to stop this demo server, and I'm going to close out of both of these, I think. For the actual API calls, we're going to be using Postman. So if you don't have Postman, you can go find it on Google. And that should be about it. So I'm going to go ahead and open this up in my VS Code editor. And the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to set up the basic like web books section that we had there along with the home page. So in order to do that, I'm going to full screen my console and bump up the font size a bit. And I'm going to say Rails G controller pages home because I'm trying to give myself a home page. After we've done that, we now need to think about what our migrations are going to look like. So for our books, all we had was a scaffold. So we'll say Rails G scaffold books. Each book has a title and a body of type text. And we can go ahead and we can run that. Once we have that, we can now go ahead and add Devise if we would like to. So we can just say bundle add Devise, and that'll add the Devise gem and run our bundle install command. Now that we've done that, we can go ahead and do a Rails G Devise :install command. That will install Devise. We'll ignore everything else because we don't pay attention. And then we can do a Rails G Devise user command to generate our user model. At this point, we can then do a Rails DB :migrate command to migrate the database. And actually, while I'm thinking about it, let's also add our admin role. So what we'll do is we'll say Rails G migration, add role to user, and we'll just say role is of type integer. And we're not going to migrate this one yet. So let's come over to our DB, migrate, create books. Nope, sorry, add role. And then at the end here, we're just going to say, let me full screen this, default of 0, which will set it to the user role once we set this up. And the magic of this is if we make an enum in the user that matches up with this exact role word, it'll be able to convert between the two. So let's come over to our models real quick and our user.rb. And I do have a tutorial covering this if you're interested. It covers setting up users, moderators, and admins, and I'll have a link to that in the video description as well. Right now, we're just going to create this role. So it's an enum role, and you have the option of a user or an admin. And that'll give you the ability to check if someone's a user or an admin by just doing a quick call. So let's do a Rails DB :migrate command to migrate the database. And now let's come into our seeds file right here. And what we're going to do is we're just going to call something. I'm going to paste it in because this part doesn't really matter that much. We're just going to say user.first_create. So it's going to try and find a user with this email. If it can't, then it'll just create it. And the only reason we're doing this is if we run the seed multiple times, then this won't error out. And the only thing special here is we're adding a role with the quote of admin. You could also do this, I think, by saying user.role admin if you wanted to grab the enum straight from the class, which is of course a better way to do it. So if we do it like that, and then we say Rails DB :seed, that should add the user. Oops, I guess we have to say roles maybe, and then we can say Rails DB :seed, and now it'll add it to the database. Okay, so now that we have that, we can go ahead and start our server, and we can refresh this page, and it'll take us to this starting page. So now let's come over to our config and our routes.rb. And just real quick, if you are looking for a specific section of this tutorial, like you don't care about this part, hover over the progress bar. I always try to include time codes so that you can skip to specific parts that you need. They're all labeled. They should be helpful. So just take a look at the progress bar and see if there's a section that's better for you than what we're covering right now. But we're going to go ahead and we're going to say this right here. We're going to say this is the root, and it's going to be the pages controller and the home action. So that gives us a root path, which will take us to the home page here. Now that we have that, we're just going to come over to, let me close these. We're going to come over to the home.html.erb file inside of our views pages home. And we're just going to paste in this small section where we check if the user is signed in. If the user is signed in, we'll do a link to a sign out button. And if the user is not signed in, we'll do a link to a sign up button. And we'll also do a link to a sign in button, just in case we want that, with a new user session path. So you can copy these down if you need to. I don't think you need to sit here and watch me type those up though. So now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to sign in to dean@example.com with a password of password. Let me just make sure my font is up a bit so you can read everything. I'll hit enter. So now we're logged in. Let's make sure we can tell that we're logged in. At the top here, I'll just say, let's see, I don't know, something like hello, and then just the email. So we'll say current_user.email, and then we can end the quotes. So that gives us a way to check that we're logged in. The next thing we want to do is add in that little p tag here where we said you can test the API with the following credentials. And at this point, what we can do is, I think I added Bootstrap. So we'll just go ahead and we'll grab Bootstrap 5 real quick. And this is mostly just for future stuff. But if you go to the Bootstrap 5 getting started introduction page, you can copy the CSS and come into layouts, application.html.erb. You just paste that in. And then you come down to the JS bundle and you just paste that in right below it. Save it. And then we can come over to our home and we can do a .container to use a Bootstrap container class. And that's just going to move everything over a little bit. Now, apparently, GitHub Copilot has different ideas for what we should be covering right now. So it's just spamming an entire suggestion, but we don't need that. Instead, we're going to have like an application later, but we don't have that right now. So instead, what we'll do is we'll just come down here and we'll say UL. Let's see, UL. We're going to have 3 LIs. So I'm going to say LI times 3. And what I'm doing for this is just, it's a thing called emit. So if you go into file, preferences, settings, and you search for EMMET, I think, and then tab expansion. You want to do the trigger expansion on tab with the check mark there, and then you can follow along with the syntax to sort of copy what I'm doing. So the first one's going to be our webbooks. Normally, if you do this properly, li times 3, you can do web books, and you can see how it's like highlighted there. And then I think you can do enter, maybe, tab, and then you can say API v1 books, tab, and then API v1 Android books. So that works, but for this first one, we actually already have this link. So what we can do is we can just do a link to the web books, and this is going to be the books path. So we'll save that, come over here and refresh, and you'll see our styling changed a bit, and everything seems a bit more together. Let's also come into our application.html.erb file, and let's do a .container around the yield. And then because we're good noodles, what we'll also do is we'll do a main tag around the main content. And that's just because you're supposed to follow those guidelines. And I think for the container, we'll also do a MT-5, which will just give us a margin top here. So now it looks a little bit better. Not really important. It's just, I don't like having it in the corner in case no one can see it. So now that we have these books right here, let's come in here and let's create a book. So I'll say, I don't know, Lord of the Flies. It's about kids or something. And I'll click create book, and it'll create the book. So at this point, as you're probably familiar, you can probably come over to your Postman. So if you come over here and you click a new tab, and then we'll grab the localhost port 3000 books. If you do a send to the books, you'll just get a basic HTML here. But if you do a send to books.json, you'll get the JSON request here that we have. And the reason why you have to do the .json is because inside of our books controller, you can see that we have the different formats here. So the format.html is the default one, and then you have the format.json. So that's something to keep in mind, and you'll see why we're going to change sort of how this works in the other controllers. But at this point, we actually have Devise added, and we have our books added. So what we can do now is come back to the home page. And what I'd like to do is I'm just going to stop the server, and I'm going to do a git add dot git commit -m init commit. And the reason why we're doing an initial commit here is just to keep track of the changes that we make going forward. Because again, if you want to implement this in your own system, you don't need this initial setup part. You just need the Doorkeeper stuff that we're about to do. So we're now going to go ahead and get started on the actual Doorkeeper component of this. This is where things are going to get a little bit heavier in terms of the content that we're covering. So the first thing we have to do is run a bundle add for the Doorkeeper gem. That'll add it to our gem file. We then want to run a Rails G Doorkeeper :install command, which will add our initializers, some locales, and a route to use Doorkeeper. It also gives you some instructions here where it says to add stuff to your initializer, choose the ORM, and then run your migration. So what we'll actually do is we can do this migration right here. That sounds like a good plan. I'll just highlight it, right click to copy it, right click again to paste it. And then it suggests running the Rails DB migrate command, but we're not going to do that yet because we have to actually modify this migration. So we'll come into our DB and our migrate here. And I think what we want to do is in the redirect URI here inside of the Oauth applications, we're going to set this to not have a null false. And I think down here with the Oauth access grants, we want to grab all of these and comment these out. So the reason why we're removing this redirect URI is just because this is used if you're signing into like Google, Apple, Facebook, Twitter, whatever. You go to the page and then you click like the confirm button and it takes you back to where you were going to. We don't need that here. There's no redirect happening. And we're getting rid of the Oauth access grants table, which means we also want to get rid of the index and the foreign keys. I'm not entirely sure what this table's for. It's just sort of suggested to remove it, I guess. Next, we're going to come into config initializers and the doorkeeper.rb file. We're going to comment out this resource owner authenticator. And instead, what we're going to do is we're going to add a section for the resource owner from credentials do, and it's just going to call the devise user.authenticate method with the params of email and password. We then need to do something with Doorkeeper that is enabling a password grant, which will allow you to use the password. And if I check inside of my Postman demo code here, when you go to log in with a existing account, you're going to pass it a password grant type, or you're going to give it a grant type of password, your email, your password, and then you have to give it the client ID and the client secret for the application that you create. Because you're making like a big kid API here that has client IDs and client secrets and stuff. So these two are coming later. These two are pretty much implied. This is the one we're adding with that section, I think. Once we have that, we then want to add a section in here for allow blank redirect URI. And it's commented out, but we want to set this to true. We then want to search for something called skip_authorization. And instead of this, what we actually want to do is just a blank skip authorization do, but we're going to set it right here just so that it's neatly organized. The last one we need is a refresh token. And we just want to do this so that we can say use refresh token. And as you can see here, maybe the refresh token is just going to allow you, because your access token that you have with, when you get this, you get back an access token. This access token, as you can see here, is set to expire in 7,200 seconds, I guess. So by having the, by giving it a refresh token, you can send the refresh token in, I think, to sort of renew this timer on your access token, I think is how that works. But okay, we now have this Doorkeeper initializer set up. The next step is going to be to come into our user.rb model, because in here we actually have to add in a custom method. What we're going to do for this one, the first thing is we need to add a validation for our email. So we'll add in a validates email, format URI mail to email regex. We can save that. And then the next step is just going to be an authentication method, which we'll put down here. And this is going to be basically straight from the Devise documentation. All you're doing is you're saying your user is equal to user.find for authentication, email is email, and then check if the password is valid. And what these ands before the dots do, it's just a way of doing something like if current underscore user and current underscore user dot admin question mark. Instead of this, what you can do is you can just collapse this and all of this, and it's going to do the same thing. So whenever you see those ands there, that's all they're doing. Not really related to the tutorial, but just in case you're curious, I guess. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to come into our routes, and this is where we're going to do something a bit interesting. So if we come into the routes, we have our use Doorkeeper, our Devise for our resources, and our root. I'm going to move the root up just because I like to see it at the top. And then below all of that, we're actually going to do a draw :API. And this allows you to draw additional routes. So we're going to take these routes and we're actually going to create a folder here. Say this is the routes folder. And inside of the routes folder, we're going to have an API.rb, which is going to match what we have right here with the API. So this allows us to set certain routes inside of this API file instead of cluttering our routes folder. So we're going to start by doing a namespace, because we're going to namespace this with :API do, and then we're going to namespace it again with v1 do end. And the reason why we're doing this is because our API is going to have versions, just in case in the future you update, make some like breaking changes or something. You want to introduce that as a v2. That way you don't break all of the existing stuff that people are using your API for in the v1. That's why Google and YouTube have like v3 of their API, and it's such a big deal when they roll it out because a lot of the stuff can be breaking changes. once we're in here, what we can do is we can set a resources for the books, and we'll take care of that in a second. The other thing we want to do is down here, we want to create a scope for the API. And actually what we can do is we can copy this entire thing right here, paste it in. We'll just change this to the word scope. Copy this, paste it here. We don't need the resources. Instead, we want to say use underscore doorkeeper do end. And then we want to say skip controllers for, I think we're missing one. I think we also need authorizations, comma. So we want to skip the controllers for authorizations, applications, and authorized applications. Now at this point, I think we're actually good to create our, let me change our spacing here to 2. I don't know why it's broken. We're good to create our applications. So I'm going to do this in our seeds file because we really don't need to see this from the console. It's all the same stuff. Basically what we're going to do is we're going to create an if statement. I'll do this above the user. We're just going to check if we don't already have any applications. So if there's no applications that exist, we're then going to create one. We can do this by calling Doorkeeper application.create, and it's going to take in a couple of arguments. First one is going to be what the name will be. For this, I'm going to call this the, let's actually make this a bit different. Let's say this is the web client. We can then give it a redirect URI and a scope. Now this is what GitHub Copilot's suggesting. So you can see that the redirect URI would be set to your localhost port 3000 and your scopes would be public. But because we're just testing this right now, I'm going to leave these blank, and I'm going to take this and I'm going to actually copy this. We're going to create a couple different versions of these. So this one right here, we're going to change it. It's going to be our iOS client. And you can see now why this is so powerful, because you can create multiple of these, and maybe you have like a Android customer and an iOS customer and they want to use your API. You can create an entire application for them. And the last one down here will be our React application. And now that we have that, we can save this, come out of here, and we can, let me move this over. We can now run a Rails DB seed command to seed our database. Actually, I'm going to do a Rails DB migrate command, and then I'll do our seed command. Okay. And now what we can do is we can come into our application controller, and inside of our, not our application controller, our pages controller. And inside of our pages controller, we can say @application equals doorkeeper dot application. And I guess .first is what we can do. Alternatively, I think we could even do a .where to grab it by the proper name. So let's maybe try that. Let's say .where name is, and what did we call it? We called it the web client. So let's say web client .first, so that we, because this will return an array even if it's just one element with the where. So we'll just say first to make sure that we're no longer using an array. And then what we can do is we can say return, well, maybe not return. We'll just say @application equals, and I think this was the way it was set up in the demo app. We can set the name to be, not that, the @application.name. We can set the client underscore ID to be the @application.uid, I think. Then we can set the client underscore secret to be the @application.secret. Let's save that. And now let's come over to our home page. And inside of our home page, inside of this container right here, what we can do is we can set the @application.as_JSON. We can save that, exit out of here, and run a Rails S command, and then refresh the server and go back to the home page. And now on the home page, you can see that we have the information being displayed, similar to how I had it earlier. So now the next thing I'd like to check, because we sort of need it to actually check to make sure this is working, is I want to create this API v1 books section. And actually we can come back to our pages controller real quick. One other way you can do this, based on what I'm looking at in the blog post, is you could probably just do a find by for the name, get rid of the first, and then refresh, and that'll also work. So then you don't have to do the where in the first. This is why they don't pay me to code in Rails. Okay, so now it's time for us to create our API controller. So the way that we handle having multiple different routes here with the books and the API books and the API Android books is basically you have your application controller, and then you're going to have another file called the API_controller.rb. And what the API controller is going to do is just like the application controller, which will come in here and copy. We'll paste it in. This is going to be the API controller. This is actually going to inherit from the application controller. And this is sort of a way to basically give you the same functionality that the application controller has, but a bit more specific. So if you're ever in the application or in the API controller, we want to, let me copy these comments because they're really helpful. Call the equivalent of the authenticate user method, but for Doorkeeper. And you can see here, instead of saying before action authenticate user, we're actually going to call before action Doorkeeper authorize. And that's going to do the exact same thing, but it's going to be API friendly. The next thing we want to do is we want to skip the CSRF token authentication. So we'll just paste that in. So that's going to be a skip before action. The next thing we want to do is set the response type. So all responses inside of this API are going to be respond to JSON, which is why we're not going to have to do that .json at the end of our URLs. And the last thing we want to do is we want to come down here, say private, and we want to create a helper method that allows us to use current user based on the token we're passing in. We can do this by calling or creating a method called def current user, where we set at current user to be equal to the user.find by the Doorkeeper token. Okay, so that sets up our API controller. The next thing we want to do is we want to create our books controller inside of our API. So unfortunately, and I know this is going to be controversial, as nice as it would be to actually just have one controller, like the books controller that lets you do .json at the end of it and everything would work. Generally speaking, this is a situation where you're going to have to set up some facades or some backend for front ends or whatever you want to call it, where you're going to have different access points depending on what your use cases are. So here, our use case for the books controller is just the ability to call .json if you're trying to scrape the website or something, and it's to show an actual rendered HTML page. For our API, its entire use case is to just be consumed by the React application that's going to be serving it, or the Android app or whatever. In that case, we need a specific API controller. So we're going to come into controllers, we're going to right click, and we're going to create a new file or a new folder and call it API. Then we'll create another new folder and call it V1. And then in there, we're going to create a new file and call it books_controller.rb. Now, the nice thing is we can actually copy this, paste it in here, click save. And now if we go back to the home page and we make this an actual functioning link. So let's come over to our pages controller and our home action right here. So inside this view, down here for the API v1 books, we're going to say a link _to those books, and then it'll be the API _v1 _books _path. Because of how we're scoping it inside of here, because it's inside of API v1, all of your stuff is just going to have this as a prefix. So whatever your scope is, that'll be your prefix. Now, if I come over here and refresh, this will link to it. And it'll take us there, and we can see that we have a Zeitwerk error. And this is just saying that it expected the controller to define a constant. This is really helpful, probably one of the most helpful errors in the entire Rails stack, because you can just copy this right here and go back into your books controller and just replace your books controller with that, and it gives you the exact format you need. So, why type many letters when few letters do trick? Now, if we refresh the page, I'm dumb. I pasted that into the wrong one. Fewest letters in the world, it still won't help you from putting it in the wrong books controller. So now we're in the actual API books controller. And if we refresh, it'll tell us, hey, look, there's no template for this. But as a note, that's totally cool if you're not trying to render HTML. If this is supposed to only be an API that's responding with 204 no content, then you're good to go, because you shouldn't be consuming this inside of a browser to begin with. What we can do here is we can do a render for the JSON of the books, and now that'll render the JSON just fine. Come over here, we're rendering it, everything is a-okay. Now this last step is going to be a bit more cumbersome. It's a little bit harder to explain too, but basically inside of our V1, I think we need to create another folder, and this is going to be the users folder. And inside of the users folder, we need to create a new file, and we need to call it registrations_controller.rb. And inside of this registrations controller, we need to do quite a bit. So we're going to say module for API, end, module for V1, end, and then module for users, end. I'm going to change this to use 2 spaces again. And I'm going to save this so it tabs it over. And now we need to do a class for the registrations controller, which is going to inherit from API controller. And now inside of here, the first step is we're going to skip that before action that we set in the API controller. Because in the API controller, we're saying Doorkeeper authorize. So we want to skip that step inside of a registration. Because of course, if we're creating a user account, we're not logged in as a user. So we shouldn't be checking to make sure we're logged in. Next thing we need to do is include a Doorkeeper registerable. This is actually a concern, which we're going to have to create. So we're going to come down to concerns, new file, and we'll say Doorkeeper_registerable.rb. And inside of this, we just need a module for the Doorkeeper registerable. It's going to extend active support concern, which is how we use it as a concern. And then we need to do some custom Doorkeeper logic. So I'm going to paste in this function, then we can talk about it. Basically, we need to generate the refresh token, which is going to attempt to return a unique token using secure random.hex32. So it'll be a 32-bit token, I think. And as soon as it has one that's unique, then it'll return that token. If it doesn't, it'll keep looping. The second thing we need to do is we need to create a render user method, which is going to take in a user, a client app, a token type equal to bearer. And it's going to attempt to create a access token from Doorkeeper. So this is a call to create an access token, which takes in a resource owner ID, application ID, refresh token ID expires, and a scope. And you don't really need to know that, but basically that generates your access token through Doorkeeper, however they set that up. And then what you can do is you can use that access token to reply or return all of your information that you need here. So if I come back to my Postman, and we'll check out how to do this in a little bit here, but when I did a request for a token, so I tried to do a token login by passing in a grant password, my email and my password, the client ID and the client secret, it replied with a response of my access token, which I then used to log in again, a token type, which is a bearer, which is just something you put in the header, your expires in, your refresh token, and your created app. As you can see, that's exactly what this response here is whenever we render a user. So basically it takes in a user and it creates this token for you. So that's basically all we have to do inside of that file. We can now come back into this registrations controller file. We can actually use those helpers that we just created. So inside of a registrations controller, the only thing we really need to do is define a create action. And we also need to define down here a private def user underscore params end. And our user params just need to be params.permit for :email, :password, and :client_ID. And if I exit out of this, at the top of our postman, when I did a call to API/v1/users, I passed in a email, which we have right here, a password, and a client ID. So that's why the API/v1/users is permitting those three, is because that's what I need to log in here. Or I guess I need to log in with these three because that's what's being permitted over here. Is a better way to phrase it. But okay, now that you have a email, password, and client ID being passed into your create method, you need to actually do the Doorkeeper logic. So we're going to say the client app is going to be Doorkeeper, : and then we can say application.find_by, and it's going to be UID, params client ID. And then we're going to say unless client_app, then we want to render a JSON where we say error. And I'm just going to copy this error message because it's very easy to understand. Doorkeepers dot error messages dot invalid client, basically saying you passed in a bad client ID. What are you doing with yourself? And then we'll give it a status of unauthorized. We can then come down here and we want to create a list of allowed parameters, allowed params, which is going to be equal to the user params. And we're going to say .accept the client ID, which is just going to say accept this part, which is just our email and our password. We can then do a user equals user.new with the allowed params. Of course, we're creating a user with an email and a password. And we say if user.save, else end. So if the user saved successfully, we want to render some JSON where we call render user and a status of OK. And remember, this render user comes from our registerable concern here, where we render this stuff out right here, which is why when I did that call, I got this info back. So that's cool. But then for our else right here, we want to do a render of some JSON where we say errors user.errors. So anything that was wrong, maybe the email already existed. We render those out and we give it a status of unprocessable entity. Now, assuming all of that is set up correctly, which is a bold assumption because of how much spaghetti code I just spit out at the screen, we should now be able to test this after we change one of the routes, I think. So I'm going to come back to our application real quick and scroll down to the API routes. And inside the API routes, we actually need to do a scope inside of our namespace where we scope to the users and the module is the users. And we want to say post is going to be our action. So we'll say post / to the registrations controller create action, which we just created. And we'll say this is going to be as user registration. And we'll save that. So now let's exit out of here and refresh the page. This looks good. Now we want to break this unless you have this token. So if you go to API books, you can't access this in the browser because that's not part of our use case. Remember, this is specifically a use case to only render JSON to our React application, for example. So what we're going to do is we're going to try and force it so that if you try to access this as an HTML page, it won't let you go to this API books anymore. So what we can do is we can come into our index action in our books controller for our API. And we can replace this render call with a respond to, where we say if the format is HTML, we're going to render no content. And if the format is JSON, we're going to render JSON as the books. You could also probably redirect if you would prefer, I guess. But I don't know. Maybe you could do something like this where you could say format.any is going to be redirect to the root path, maybe, or maybe root URL is a better thing to put in here. I don't know, I'm experimenting right now, so we'll see. Yeah, so that will now redirect you unless you're specifically making a JSON request. So if I come to /API v1 books.json, that'll take us here. But of course, the biggest key here is we can change this to inherit from our API controller. So if I undo all of this and I change this to be our API controller, and I refresh the page, and now if I click on API books, it's not going to render anything because you are now a 401 unauthorized when you try and do that because you're not passing the Doorkeeper authorization here. But if I click on the web books, this is our regular controller. This one still works just fine. And if I come into our books controller and I say before underscore action, authenticate underscore user, exclamation mark. And I'm just going to leave this for all. You could, of course, set an only here. If I say before action, authenticate underscore user, exclamation mark, save this, refresh the page. Now, if I grab this and open up an incognito tab, and I go over to localhost port 3000/books, it'll now redirect me to the sign up page. So say Dean @exam, well, maybe I'll do another user. Say sign up, john@doe.com with a password of password. And this might break because I haven't set up Turbo properly, which it did. So I can then say /sign_in and sign in as john@doe.com and a password of password. Now, if I'm logged in, I can see this page. That's great, but what if we want to take this a step further and restrict a route to only be accessible to admins? Because of course, this tutorial is trying to cover as much as possible, and that is a very realistic use case. You want admin accounts to be able to do stuff. That's why we created those admins. For this, what we're gonna do is we're gonna move this down here, and we're going to create a new folder. This is gonna be inside of API v1, and we're gonna create a facade for an Android app. Say new Android app, and this is going to be the books_controller.rb. So we're going to come into our main books controller, copy this, come over to our Android books controller. And in here, we need to do, after the colons, we'll say Android : books controller. And for this one, I want to get rid of the edit, update, destroy, and I want to just have a show action for the set book. I then want to do a skip before action for the Doorkeeper authorize. And then I want to get rid of the new, update, and destroy actions. And I want our show to be, let's just do a render JSON at book. This one's fine. Our set book's fine. And for our book params, we just need to require the book. You then come down to our API routes, and we can say, okay, we got our resources for our books in our v1, but now I want to have a namespace for the Android do end, and we can say resources books in here. You can then come up to our helpers application helper.rb, and in here we can just paste in a quick helper method, where we say is admin ? And then we just say unless the current user and .admin, which we talked about earlier. So it's just checking if the current user is signed in. If they are, then we check if they're an admin. And because it's an unless, which means it won't do anything unless the user.admin is false, in which case you're not an admin. Then if you're not an admin, it'll redirect you to the new user session path, or you could even say the root path, with an alert that says you are not authorized to access this page. Okay, so let's come over to here. We're still logged in as john@doe.com, and I'm gonna refresh the books path. That seems fine. Come to the root path, and now let's change this link. So let's come back to our, pages controller home view, and let's create this link. So I'm gonna copy this line, paste it down here. We'll say API v1 Android books, and we'll say API underscore v1 underscore Android underscore books path, I think. Refresh the page. Looks good. I'm now going to click on this, and it's not going to work because we didn't actually call that method inside of our Android controller. So let's come over to our Android books controller. So inside of here, what you could do is you could paste in the application helper, and then you could, and I'm doing this a bit backwards from how I did it last time, but you could do a before action, or before action is underscore admin question mark. We'll save this. Okay, so we're getting an error here for an undefined method for the brackets. So I think the Doorkeeper token's not defined. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say return unless this is defined, maybe as like a guard clause. Then we can refresh, and now it looks like it's returning us. One thing that I would like to point out is generally your before action for the admin would go on your overall books controller, because you'd probably want to use this as like your dashboard, I guess. But we'll just leave that alone for now. So we now have these set up. I'd now like to actually try these. So let's come into our render users, because we're rendering out the user in our concern. I'd like to, after the ID, let's render out the email. This is going to be the user.email, and then let's render out the role, which is going to be the user.role, and you'll see why we're doing that in a second. Now let's open up Postman for probably the hardest part. Now, each of these requests are going to require something different, and we're going to have to add in a whole bunch of stuff to make them work. So we're going to test registering for an account first, which is going to have to go to API v1/users. And to register an account, we need the client ID. So I'm going to move this over to here, and we're going to grab the client ID here, which we conveniently have displayed in our app. Now, of course, you could do different client IDs for like your Android books or whatever if you wanted to. In this case, I'm just using this first client ID from our web books for the simplicity's sake. Again, they're not like accessing separate databases. They're just sort of like ways for the client to connect. So I'm going to paste in that client ID. I'm going to uncomment this. And I'm going to register an account called test@case.com with a password of password. And I'm going to comment out whatever I have down here. And then I think we should be good to go. So I'm going to make a post request to localhost port 3000 /API/v1/users. And we'll click send. We got a 400 bad request. Oh, and this is why right here. This needs to be user_params, not params. Let me come back over to here now and try this again. I'll click send. We're still getting an error, so something else is wrong. Now we're getting an error on line 31 in user params. Okay, so apparently I was running into issues with my commented out stuff here. So I'm wondering if I have to take this and move it down to the bottom if it doesn't like having comments after the request. So I'm going to try this. And the other thing I changed was the client app was missing an equal symbol here because I don't pay enough attention. I'm going to click send, and there we go. Now it's working. Okay. So I guess it just doesn't like having comments afterwards. So I'll just keep it moved towards the bottom. So now we've logged in. We've registered this test@case.com account. We've logged in with it because we have our access token right here. So reasonably, we should now be able to use this access token to access the books controller. And we'll do that before we log out. So I'm going to come over to this other tab where I have API v1 books loaded up. And I'm going to try to get this real quick. So I'm going to get it, and you're going to see 401 401 unauthorized. And you don't actually have to attach anything to the body here, but you do have to come into the headers, create an authorization header, and give it a name or a value of bearer space and then your token. So here you'll see bearer space, the token we just got as a response. So this access token. And I'm going to send this to my API v1 books controller. And you can see here, Lord of the Flies, it's about kids or something. But now let's try to go to API v1, I think /Android/books, right? And we'll click send on that. And we'll get an error here, which is responding with the entirety of the application layout right here. So that looks like an HTML response. Let's do a content type of maybe let's just do JSON instead. There we go. And now I'm going to click send on this. It looks like it's still replying with that. Okay, I think I figured out the problem, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me. This seems to still be working. I had to change the application helper to do a respond to do format. I made it respond with a HTML format that just had the old stuff and the JSON format that had the new stuff. But when I did this, it was still rendering the full HTML page. For some reason, when I changed this to JSON, it's just grabbing the first response. So I click send and that works. And here our content type is set to application/JSON. So I'm not really sure because I searched for JSON and that looks to be the only choice we have. Why that isn't working. But now that we have that, we can now check what happens if we have an actual authorized bearer. So now let's try to go to /books again. We click send on that and that takes us to the right place. So you can see what happens between those two. One we're authorized to access as a logged in user. The other one we're not. So now let's try to log out of this account. To do that, we're going to comment this out because this is our API v1 users request. And we're now going to do a request to the revoke. So let me move this down a bit. I'm going to grab this revoke block right here, paste it down at the bottom, and I'll uncomment this part. So the first thing we need is a token. And that token is the one we were using earlier, so we can just copy this again. We can paste this in as our token, or we can grab our refresh token and we can revoke that. Either one will work. So I'm going to leave our access token as our choice. And then we need to update our client and our secret. So I'm going to grab the client here, paste this in, and then we need our secret, which I don't think we have in here yet. So let me grab that. This is it right here. And we can paste it in right here. And we'll send this, and I'll actually try to do something. Maybe I'll leave it like this. I'll move this over so I can click send. If you look in the console, as soon as I click send, oops, we actually have to change this to be the Oauth/revoke path. Click send. That's blank. And if I scroll down to wherever, you can see we update the OAuth access tokens. We set the revoked at. And now we should be unable to access even the books. So you can see here 401 unauthorized. So now our bearer token doesn't work because we're signed out. Now let's try to sign in again. But this time we're going to sign in as an admin account. So I'm going to copy this down here, uncomment it, and I'm going to change this to the dean@example.com account. And we can go to /tokens, I think, to log in. Is that correct? Actually, we need to grab this one for the OAuth token. So I'm going to paste this one down here. So to log in with an existing account, I need to uncomment this first of all. You need to set a grant type of password. Enter your email, your password, and then you need your client ID and your client secret again, which we actually have right up here. So we can paste these in and then uncomment them. And now if we go to the OAuth tokens and we click send, oops, this needs to be OAuth token, not OAuth tokens. And we're getting an invalid password grant here because this needs to be dean@example.com. So we can see at least that works. And now we can log into the dean@example.com. Now this one doesn't have a response that includes our role, but we should now be able to access both the books. If we go over, if we grab the token here And actually what I like to do is I like to grab this and just paste it in and comment it out just in case I lose this, so I still have access to it. So I'm going to grab the access token, and I'm going to come over to here into our header, and I'm going to paste in the token that we just got. And then I'll click send to the books. We can access the books. And now we're going to try to access the Android books, which we restricted to admin only. And we can access the Android books as well. The last thing to do here, now that we've done all of that, is to add cores. So I'm going to stop the server, and I'm going to full screen it. And I'm going to say bundle add rack-cores. So this is going to give us our cross-origin request service, I think is what it stands for. Basically, this is what allows you to allow list or deny list certain IP addresses and restrict what you can do to a API. So we can come into our initializers, we can create a new file, call it cores.rb, and we're just going to add in some code. And this code usually comes with a default Rails app if you use the -- API flag. Basically, you do all of the config stuff, and then you say allow. In this case, we're allowing an asterisk, but let's say you only wanted one IP address to work. Maybe you only wanted people to be able to connect to this from Deanin.com. That would work. You could also include multiples. If there's multiple things you'd want to like allow list, then that's how you would do it. Alternatively, you could say like http:// localhost port 3000, right? So we need a colon there. Then you can say which resources you want to allow. So here we're allowing anything through the API v1. Headers are any. You can, of course, restrict these to, you would probably want something like authorization, I guess, is probably an important one because that's the one we've been using in here. And you'd probably want content type 2. Oops. So you'd want to include that in there as well. But we can leave this as any. The other thing you would want would be which methods you want to allow. So get, post, patch, put, and delete. Delete usually isn't included by default, but this will allow you to do stuff like delete books if you wanted to in the future. But once we add all of this, let's run a Rails S again. And actually, yeah, no, this should be fine. We're going to come over to our books. We can still access our books. I'm now going to stop the server and I'm going to change this to 3001. I will start the server and I'll click send. Now I'm going to grab this. I'm going to come over to a different tab that I can't delete for some reason. I'm going to come over to this tab and then I'm going to grab this header right here. And in this tab, this fresh tab, I'm going to set the content type. I'll give it an authorization and I'll change the bearer here to be that bearer that we had over there. Make sure it looks good. That looks fine. Now I'll click send. Now the last thing I'll do is I will just change this back, to an asterisk again, just because I like it to be like that, because in this case, we're going to be using it for a bunch of different stuff. And yeah, I think that's going to do it for this tutorial on using Doorkeeper. I think I've covered just about everything I wanted to. My plan is to use this in future tutorials, this specific application, to create some React tutorials that involve using a Rails backend where you can log in and log out. That's why we're working with different applications and clients here. So this is a much more robust system than what we've been using before. Now, if you're interested in getting caught up with using React before we jump into some more in-depth tutorials, I have a React video that covers all of the basic CRUD actions with a basic scaffold in Rails. And I have a link to that React TypeScript Redux tutorial on the screen right now.